We do not have to operate a surplus. It is not the end of the world if a government is debt. As you say, most governments have been in debt most of the time. All right? That's point number one. Point number two is that the current level of debt we have now is not due to public spending on public services out of control. How can I say that for certain? Because the figures are there in public. If you go to an organization called Eurostat, they are the branch of the European Union that compiles all the statistics. So they're a bit of that European government, Eurostat. And there are tables there which you can easily access, and I can tell you exactly how to do it. Big tables showing you debt as a percentage of GDP for all the European nations going back to, I think, about 2004. All right? And to take the example of the UK, in 2008, our debt as a percentage of GDP was 42%. Not very high. That's what it was. And it had been increasing by a little fraction over 1% every year for about, well, as far back as those figures went. So it had not been out of control. Spain had, in 2008, was bringing in tax more than it was spending. So much for the feckless Spanish. That's Eurostat figures. Between 2008 and 2014, our debt doubled to 84%. Now, I don't know, can anyone think of anything happened between 2008 and 2014? Anyone at all? Was it that nurses got their pay quintupled and they all went on all expenses paid holidays to the Bahamas at our expense? Was it that? Was it that one? No, people are shaking their heads. No, it wasn't that. Can anyone remember anything that might have happened that cost us a bit of money starting in 2008? Anyone remember anything? The banks. Yeah, God, good job you remembered. Yeah, because the government's forgotten. Yeah. And PricewaterhouseCoopers, I think that's the way then, PCW. Yeah, that's right. They did a study, and you have to admit, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Waterhouse, whatever the hell they're called, are not known as, you know, a bunch of rabid Trotskyites. They did a big study. I've got it at home. It's the kind of exciting thing I read. And it says extremely clearly that at the time of the beginning of the debt crisis, 2008, UK debt was not out of control, government debt was quite low, and the bulk of debt was private corporate debt. That's PricewaterhouseCoopers Waterhouse, or whatever they are, saying that. So the debt we took on, this sudden expansion of debt, is because we bailed out the banks. And no other reason. No other reason. However, if as a political party you want, it's been your goal for decades to shrink the size of the state, to shrink the size of public services and to privatize them, what a wonderful story to point at that enormous pile of debt, claim that it was to do with public spending out of control, and then say, and if we don't get that under control, the sky will fall on your head and you'll end up in that ditch with poo on your head again. And so the only way to get that down is to rein in this supposed public spending out of control, so cut everything, and then sell it off to the private sector, who we all know how wonderful they are, because, well, look how well they did in 2008. That's why. This is purely ideologically driven, purely. It has nothing to do with you must get down, otherwise the world ends. It doesn't. You do have to have some kind of relationship between the amount of money in circulation and the amount of public debt and the amount of economic activity. That is true. Which is why, when that crisis happened in 2008, the sensible thing would have been to liquidate the banks that had failed, they were insolvent, reinvest in brand new banks. If we put in 10 billion into the carcass of RBS, at 10 to 1 leverage, they would have had 100 billion to lend in a bank that had no debt, because it would have been wiped out. We didn't do that. it would have been sensible to take a small fraction of the 1.4 trillion, Bank of England's figures, not mine, that the banking crisis has cost us so far, and put that direct into people's pockets. You could have literally written a cheque for several £1,000s to every person in the country and said, there you go. That's quantitative easing in another name. And what they would have done is use it to pay off their debts or buy stuff, which would have set the economy going. And people say, you can't do that. My goodness, the moral hazard. The moral hazard? What the heck do you call it if you just shove it into a bank which was bankrupt, which did illegal things, which manipulated LIBOR, which manipulated the commodities market, laundered money, and evaded taxes? That's not moral. That's not a moral problem, is it not? Oh, apparently not. Okay. If we had done that, we would have done something. But instead, what we did is we put that money into the banks, saying, the only way to get money into the real economy is if the banks do it. A, that's a lie. And B, they didn't. Sorry, that's a long-winded answer. There's no point in saying I'm going to give you an even-handed answer because they have the newspapers, the BBC and ITV and Channel 4 to give you their version. So I'll be damned if I'm going to help them with their version. I'll give you my version. Anybody else?